Possible worlds. So, this is an area of philosophy that has really exploded since the late 60s and 70s, talk of possible worlds, which is kind of funny because the first person to talk about possible worlds was the philosopher Leibniz, the early modern philosopher, and then he talked about it in great detail, but because of sort of criticisms of Leibniz and probably a lot to do with mocking of one of Leibniz's ideas, famously by the writer Voltaire in a novel called Candide, talk of possible worlds kind of went away, but until it was revived in a big way by lots of philosophers, but probably the biggest name, Saul Kripke and David Lewis. And David Lewis's view of possible worlds is one that, as he kind of ruefully says, always gets him incredulous stares. When he describes what he believes about possible worlds, people just look at him funny. And as he says, I don't know how to argue with an incredulous stare. So we'll be looking prominently at David Lewis's view. This is sort of hinted at in an early work of his called Counterfactuals. And then later on, this prompted responses by critics. And then he addressed the critics with a book called On the Plurality of Worlds that was published in the 80s, which really sort of also set off a huge flurry of responses. So this is just going to be a sketch though. All right. So before we talk about possible worlds, another concept in philosophy that sort of triggered the discussion of possible worlds originally, although now possible worlds are used in a much wider array than just dealing with this concept, is the concept of necessity. So if you think about truth, we say that certain things are true. So it's true that grass is green. It's also true that 2 + 2 = 4. Traditionally, we distinguish, we say, although they're both true, they're true in different ways. The 2 + 2 = 4 seems to be, in some sense, more true than the fact that grass is green. Why? Because grass could have not been green. And in fact, come fall or in, a particularly bad drought, grass ceases to be green. Or, consider the claim today is whatever the day is. Today is Wednesday. That's true, but of course tomorrow it won't be. Whereas 2 + 2 = 4, in some sense we think it cannot possibly be false. So necessity comes in a pair with possibility. So we say certain things are necessary if they cannot possibly be false. Okay, now this notion of necessity has itself a storied history in philosophy. For example, the great Christian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas makes a distinction between two kinds of necessity. And he does it in the context of responding to an argument, a famous puzzle for theists, people who believe in a God like the God of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And the puzzle is the challenge that God's foreknowledge seems to present for human freedom. The puzzle goes basically like this. If God is omniscient, as he's supposed to be, then he knows what I'm going to do before I do it. He has foreknowledge as well as knowledge of all the facts of the past and the present. He knows what's going to happen before it happens. But if he knows what I'm going to do before I do it, then I can't not do whatever it is he knows that I will do. But if I can't not do it, then I don't have choice about it, and I'm not free. And then it seems very unjust of God to punish us for whatever we do. So, why did God punish Eve from eating the apple? He knew that she was going to do it, so therefore she couldn't not do it. So in some sense, it seems just perverse of God to punish Eve and, by extension, all of humanity afterwards. Okay, Aquinas' analysis of this is that there's a conflation of two different kinds of necessity going on in the presentation of this puzzle. He says what God's foreknowledge means is this: necessarily what is known to be sitting, say that the issue is whether or not I'll sit in 10 minutes, and God knows that I will. So God knows that I will sit. Now it's true, necessarily what is known to be sitting is sitting. So necessarily it is true, it is necessarily true that what God knows to sit will be sitting. But this, and this is called de dicto necessity. That's Latin for of the words. So the necessity is being applied to a proposition. And so the question is, what's being said is that a certain proposition is necessarily true. The necessity is about the proposition, de dicto, about the words or that the proposition is expressed in. But it's only a problem for human free will if it's the necessity applies to me. That is, when I sit, it's necessary that I sit, that I cannot possibly not sit. For me to be free, it has to be possible for me not to sit. Whereas if I'm necessarily sitting, then it's not possible for me not to sit, so I don't have choice. But what Aquinas says is that this is a fallacy. To infer de re necessity, re means thing. So de re means, necessity de re is necessity applied to the thing, specifically me in this case. So a de dicto necessity, a proposition being necessarily true, does not imply de re necessity of me that I am necessarily sitting. And it's the de re necessity that would be a challenge to free will. Anyway, whether or not you think that solves the problem of God's foreknowledge, the challenge of God's foreknowledge to freedom, it's a distinction that can be found in Aquinas between de dicto and de re necessity. All right, so there's this notion of necessity, and it appears to come in two different flavors. And of course, there's also this notion of possibility. Now, there's also, related to the notion of possibility, we talk, in everyday talk, we talk about the way things could have been, possibilities, but both the way things could have been in the past and the way things could be in the future. So, I don't know, the Trailblazers could have won the 2000 NBA Finals if Rasheed Wallace hadn't missed 15 shots in a row, or if the refs hadn't been totally biased in favor of the Lakers. We say things like that. And we think, like all propositions, that was a proposition, and like all propositions, they have truth value. But what's weird about statements about possibilities is they don't seem to be made true in the same way that other regular propositions do. So consider the view of truth and meaning of around the beginning of the 20th century, Frege, Russell, early Wittgenstein. Early Wittgenstein in the Tractatus describes language as sort of a picture of the world. So propositions are true when they accurately represent what the world is like. So in other words, the world as it is a truth maker that determines whether or not a proposition is true. So for example, I don't know, Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy is a proposition. It's true if in fact it was Lee Harvey Oswald who shot Kennedy. So the truth of the proposition depends on there being a world that can determine whether or not it's true. You can probably see where I'm headed. But what about the Trailblazers would have won if Wallace hadn't missed all those shots? If that's true, it's not true in virtue of the actual world, because in the actual world, he did miss all those shots, and they lost. So how is it true? We think certain things are true, like, you know, if the Germans hadn't invaded Russia, they would have won World War II, something like that. People make claims like this all the time. But how do we, what is it, if we're going to say that it's true, what makes it true? Well, this is where the idea of possible worlds comes in. But before we get into that, so I just wanted to make it clear that necessity and possibility, although they might be thought of as kind of obscure philosophical concerns, our entire way of talking about the world is just drenched in these notions. All the time we make claims about the way the world could have been. And in fact, the more you look at the way we deal with the world, the more infected with these notions of possibility you find that it is. Which makes it the case that there's good reason to resist our old friend Willard van Orman Quine when he says basically a pox on necessity, and in particular de re necessity. So Quine has two famous examples that he uses to suggest that the very notion of de re necessity, that certain things can be necessary features of objects, certain properties can be necessary features of objects, is just a confused notion that we should stop using. It just doesn't make sense. The mathematical cyclist. The mathematical cyclist is the one, here's an example of a man who is a mathematician. Given that he is a mathematician, in his status as a mathematician, he is necessarily rational, because you cannot be, that is, capable of rational thought, let's say. You cannot be you cannot do mathematics without that. So in order to be a mathematician, he's necessarily rational. But he's also a big cycling fan. In order to be a cyclist, Quine says, this is possibly not true, but just go with it for the sake of the example, he is necessarily two-legged. He's necessarily bipedal. And not necessarily rational. You can be a cyclist without being rational, and you can be a mathematician with one leg. You can be, so this one person, because of his two hobbies, is both necessarily and not necessarily rational, and both necessarily and not necessarily two-legged. At this point, Quine says, see, you can't make sense of this notion. How is it that you can talk about necessary features of somebody? Isn't it just, he wants to say that there are no necessary features of somebody. There's just, if there is necessity, it's just de dicto. So you can say, it's necessarily true that as a cyclist, somebody must be bipedal. And it's necessarily true that as a mathematician, they must be rational. But there's no necessity of the person themselves. There's no necessary features. He also says that necessity has, there's no individuation conditions. And this is a big deal for Quine. Quine says there's no identity without identity conditions. Unless you can specify where one possible entity begins and ends, you can't talk about possible entities. You have to be able to talk about them clearly and precisely in order for talk of them to make sense at all. And he says you can't. And to give an example, he says, imagine a fat man in the doorway. There is a possible fat man in that doorway, let's say. But there's also a possible bald man in that doorway, because there could have been a fat man there and there could have been a bald man there. And then he says, are they the same man? How many men are there in that doorway? We can't answer these questions, so therefore he says we should junk this idea of possibility, of necessity and possibility. Now, he says he doesn't junk de dicto, but he has another problem with de dicto. And if you remember de dicto necessity, if you remember in two dogmas of empiricism, the first of the dogmas of empiricism that he's attacking is the distinction between analytic and synthetic. And he says analytic is part of a circle of notions, each one of which needs defining, but it's only possible to define them in terms of the others. And these are analytic, necessity, and necessary and a priori. And he says you have to escape that circle to explain these concepts. If you can't escape that circle, then all of the concepts are poorly defined. He does consider a way to define analytic as necessary, as analytic truths are necessary truths. But then the problem that he has with necessity is that necessary concepts are necessary contexts, are non-extensional. So extensional contexts are, logic is extensional. And that means it obeys the rule of intersubstitutivity salva veritate. That is, if you take out one term and replace it with a co-referential term, the truth value of the statement should be unaffected. But a famous example that Quine gives to show that this doesn't work with necessity is he says, this is true. Necessarily, 9 is greater than 8. It's also true that the number of planets, which was true when Quine was writing, the number of the planets in the solar system is 9, of course. Kind of adding to Quine's point, now we say it's 8 because we've dropped Pluto. But when he was writing, it was 9. So he said, so necessarily, the number of the planets is, 9 is greater than 8. But 9 is the same as the number of the planets. But if you take out 9 in that sentence, necessarily 9 is greater than 8, you get, and replace it with the number of planets, it says necessarily the number of planets is greater than 8. And of course, that is false now, because it turns out that the number of the planets has changed. So you cannot, in other words, the intersubstitutivity salva veritate breaks down. You can't just take out a term and replace it with one that refers to the same thing and preserve necessity. And Quine preferred extensional contexts. Extensional contexts were much more satisfactory. We had a much more rigorous analysis of them. So he was very suspicious of non-extensional contexts. But on the other hand, extensional contexts can't give us everything that we want. For example, the extensional way of talking about properties is to say two properties are the same if they have the same extension. So a property is merely the things that have that property. So red, the extensional analysis of red is all the red things. That's what the property is on Quine's view. But then the trouble is, this seems to give a two-course analysis of synonymy. So for example, his famous example is renate, which means having kidneys, and caudate, which means having a heart, turn out to be synonymous according to extensional, because all the things that have kidneys are the things that have a heart. They're one and the same. They have the same extension. And that's a problem in itself. Now, enter David Lewis. David Lewis shares a lot of Quine's commitments. So, for example, he likes the idea that we should explain things like properties in terms of their extension. The alternative, which we haven't got into but is a big metaphysical issue, is to be someone like Plato, or one main alternative is to be someone like Plato and say that a property itself is a thing that's distinct from all the things that have it. And of course for Plato that's the forms. So redness is this special magical thing called the form of red, and all the red things are just red because they somehow participate or resemble that. People like Quine and Lewis don't like that idea, although you might wonder why David Lewis has objections to that given what he believes, which we're about to find out. But one of the uses of possible worlds is that if you believe in possible worlds, if you can make your extensionality go much further. So renate and caudate are coextensional in this world, even though clearly they mean different things. But if you're talking about, if instead you focus not just on our world, but on all possible worlds, then it turns out that renate and caudate are not coextensional. So an extensional synonymy can now distinguish between renate and caudate, and it can do just as well as intentional synonymy, which is the thing Quine was suspicious of. So we can stick with Quine's commitment to extensionality without having to pay the cost that he did, which was to junk intentional notions like meaning. He was very suspicious of meaning in general. Whereas David Lewis says, no, we can have the best of both worlds. We can have the advantages of Quine's commitment to extensionality. It's clean, it's rigorous, it reduces strange notions like meaning to much more clear and well understood notions. We can have those advantages without the disadvantage that you can't distinguish between renate and caudate, because now you can say renate and caudate have different extensions, because there are some possible worlds where there are creatures with kidneys that don't have hearts. That's possible. So therefore the extension of renate, which includes these possible worlds, is different from the extension of caudate. Okay. So possible worlds are great. They give you all kinds of philosophical tools. In his book on the plurality of worlds, the opening part of it is called A Philosopher's Paradise, Possible Worlds. And it's true. Philosophers have just played in the toolbox of philosophers' worlds perhaps too much since the late 60s and 70s when it became respectable. One of the earliest triggers for this discussion is something that most people wouldn't want to read because it's formal. People came up with a semantics for modal logic. So modal logic is a kind of symbolic logic that can handle possibly a necessary. I'm not going to go into it because it's too rich for my blood, but if you ever see symbols like this, that means it's de dicto necessity. It means necessarily P, and P of course is a proposition. So it's saying that P is necessarily true. And the other symbol that you see in modal logic is that, which means possibly P. And you can define them in terms of each other. Necessarily P means it is not possible that not P is true. So this is equivalent to this. Anyway, that's modal logic, and that's just the symbols that are used. But people like a guy called Stalnaker and Kripke himself worked out a semantics for modal logic. Now, that's okay. Semantics for modal logic, you're just talking about rules for applying modal notions. Because one of Quine's complaints about talking about necessity is different philosophers had different intuitions about what was necessary. So they said they had different inferences that they could draw from a certain, saying a certain set of things were necessary. Some people inferred that some things were necessary, other people inferred that different things were necessary. There didn't seem to be clear-cut rules. Well, once these guys like Stalnaker and Kripke came up with the semantics for a rigorous modal logic, that problem was dealt with. But then there's the question is, well, what do you mean what are these possible worlds? What are they? And here's where David Lewis gets the incredulous stares, because David Lewis has a view that he calls modal realism. And according to him, possible worlds are, now I should have said this up front, it's a little misleading to call them possible worlds. A much better way to talk about them is possible cosmoses, cosmoi, or a notion that is now incredibly familiar thanks to Marvel and DC, alternate realities. So, or, dimensions. Because the idea is that each possible world is a complete universe in which things are different. Well, our world is actually a possible world too. It has to be possible because it happened. So it is one of the possible worlds. But a possible world is a way things could have been. And there are infinite possible worlds. And they're entire, complete, self-contained universes. They are spatio-temporally isolated from each other. So that's the difference between David Lewis and Marvel and DC. Marvel and DC are always having people bursting, like the Spider-Verse. People are always bursting in from other universes into this one and causing all kinds of problems. David Lewis says that's not even in principle possible. They're completely isolated from each other. You can't get there from here. They're not in the space-time. There isn't even you can't even point to a direction in which they are because they're not in any direction from here. They're completely isolated from each other. But they're equally real. So, one way of putting this is David Lewis was himself an atheist. He didn't believe in God. But technically, he is an atheist polytheist. Why? Because when he said he was an atheist, he meant that in our world, the actual world, there is no God. But is God possible? Sure. So in other possible worlds, there is a God. So other possible worlds do have gods. And is there a possible world in which Thor and all the Norse gods are real? Absolutely. Is there another possible world when the Aztec gods are real? Sure. So he's polytheistic in that sense. Why? Because he thinks gods are real, just not actual. Okay, so he makes a distinction between real and actual, and this is very important. Actual means this, our world, our universe. I am actual. Now, a world in which I am emperor of the universe exists. So that's real, because he's a realist about that possibility. So I really am emperor of the universe, but I'm not actually emperor of the universe. I don't know if I'd be a good emperor, so it's just as well. Well, I imagine that other universe is pretty much a hellhole, but it's real. So actual is an indexical, according to David Lewis. An indexical is a word that changes its reference depending on its utterance. So I is an indexical. What does I refer to? Well, it depends who says it and where. And here is an indexical. It's a temporal indexical. What time does it refer to? It depends on when it is said. Here is a spatial indexical. Now is a temporal indexical. Okay, so you get the basic idea. Actual is also an indexical. What is actual just depends on who's saying it. So everybody's world is actual to them. Where I'm emperor of the universe, that's the actual universe for that person. Now, so what does Lewis have to say about unicorns don't exist? We would say unicorns don't exist is true. And if you're talking about what's real, he would have to deny that. Unicorns do exist, but unicorns aren't actual. So he would have to say, well, when we say this, we're talking about actuality rather than reality. Now, why would Lewis be a modal realist? I mean, you can see why he gets incredulous stares. So, because he's saying, and he's quite open about this, he says, angels exist. I'm a complete atheist, and angels and gods exist. They're just not actual. The implications of this are massive. One of my favorite implications is that, favorite is probably the wrong way to talk about it, is that the problem of evil is completely insolvable. Now, the problem of evil, of course, is that why is there suffering in the world if God is all-powerful and all-loving? And actually, talk about possible worlds was kind of brought into being by Leibniz to deal with this issue. Because what Leibniz says, Leibniz infers, and this is the view of Leibniz's that Voltaire mocked him for, Leibniz infers that this must be, the world in which we live, the universe in which we live, must be the best of all possible worlds. Why? Because if it was possible for God to make a world with less suffering in it, or a better world, then the fact that he didn't make that world would count against him. That would show that he's not perfect. So given that he is perfect, and that he will create the best possible world, a world in which if there is suffering, it has to exist, because if you removed it, the world it would cause some other thing not to exist, and it would make the world worse than it actually is. So Leibniz argued that given that God would create the best of possible worlds, this must be it. So why is there suffering in this world? Well, that's what you need a theodicy for. And for example, one theodicy is the suffering in this world is a byproduct of human freedom. But human freedom is so valuable that a world in which we have freedom plus some suffering as a necessary concomitant of that freedom is better than a world in which there is no suffering and we're not free. So therefore, what explains the suffering in our world is human freedom, and human freedom is a very good thing. All right, so that's the suggestion. Now, of course, in Candide, Voltaire mocks this idea that this is best of both possible worlds by just describing in detail the horrible things that happen. And there's a guy called Dr. Pangloss in that who believes Leibniz's view. It's not clear if he's meant to be Leibniz himself. And keeps saying, as things get worse and worse and horrible things happening, well, this is the best of all possible worlds. But, if Lewis's view of possible worlds is right, it's not Leibniz's view. Leibniz's view is that only one world exists, the actual world. Lewis says all possible worlds exist. So there are worlds that are nothing but torment, just complete agony all the time. And in fact, every bad thing that could possibly happen really happens. For the person it's happening to, it is actual, but not for us. So, how do you explain that? Well, I guess Lewis would say, well, you can't blame God for all the possible worlds because God is relativized to each world. But I think if you're Christian, you'll want to say that God is responsible for all the worlds. You don't want to say that God is our God is just a local God. If there are other universes that exist, our God has to be all-powerful, has to have created those too. So that's a disagreement there. But anyway, so, you can see how discussion of possible worlds gets into all areas. But it is true that a lot of Christians do talk about possible worlds. And in fact, one of the early philosophers to get into discussions about possible worlds is Alvin Plantinga, who wrote a 1974, I think, book, The Nature of Necessity. And one of the things he does in that, besides he criticizes Lewis in that, but one of the other things he does is he shows that using possible worlds you can give a modal version of the ontological argument. The ontological argument is an attempt to prove that God must exist because God is by definition perfect. Perfect means has all properties. Therefore, God can't be perfect without having the property of existence, so therefore God exists. That's a rough and ready version of it. But he gives a modal version of it, and he argues that that works, so God must exist. In this book, all about technical issues about possible worlds. So possible worlds covers a lot of ground. Now, why on earth would David Lewis be a modal realist? Because plenty of other philosophers love possible worlds, but they don't think that in order to use the tool of possible worlds, they have to be realists about it. Now, those people, Lewis refers to as ersatzists. Ersatz is a word that means a sort of a copy of something that isn't the real thing, and it carries a connotation of inferiority. People say, ersatz statues or something like that, meaning that you've got just fake copies. Like, I think a lot of arty people would look at pictures of Donald Trump's apartment and say, it's ersatz class. It's just an attempt to be classy that falls short. So carries negative implications, which is why he uses it to sort of talk about alternative views. It's kind of a subtle dig. For example, Plantinga is what Lewis would call an ersatzist. He doesn't believe that possible worlds are worlds just like ours. So ersatzists believe that reality and existence reality and actuality are the same thing. That all that is real is what is actual, so there's only one actual universe that really exists. So what are these ways things could have been? There are, various suggestions. One prominent suggestion is they are like world books, that they're a possible world that isn't ours is just a description of the way things could have been. So, because you can imagine a description of our world that is just a set of propositions. It lists all of the facts that are true about our world. Now, there would be infinitely big, but of course, don't worry about that. So a complete description of our world would be possible. Well, if it's possible for our world, it's possible for all possible worlds. So all these other possible worlds are just descriptions, whereas our world is a description that is also actual, that also exists in space-time. So possible worlds are just sort of books of sets of propositions or whatever that describe this other universe. Now, Lewis doesn't like that because these possible worlds, like the propositions of which they're made, are abstract entities. So, here you might think, wow, this is a case of the pot calling the kettle black. Lewis doesn't like an untidy ontology. So this is Quine's, one of Quine's most basic insistences, and that is to get your ontology as stripped down as is required. You don't want an ontological slum, as I believe that was Quine's phrase. You don't want to allow things into your ontology. An ontology is just, your ontology is the set of things that you are committed to the existence of. So for example, electrons are in our ontology and have been even before we could detect them. Why did we believe in electrons before we could detect them? Because of their explanatory power. Because we say we must believe in electrons because by inference to the best explanation. We notice all these phenomena, and the best explanation of these phenomena is if these things, electrons, exist. So therefore we believe in those. Lewis, at least in his early work, says, hey, that's exactly my reasons for believing in possible world. Look at all of the phenomena that they would explain. How is it? We believe that counterfactual claims have truth value. We believe that if Rasheed Wallace had not missed 15 shots in a row, the Trailblazers would have beaten the Lakers. We believe that. We believe that with all our hearts. Damn you, Sheed. Well, he got his title with the Pistons, at least. Lucky for him. But so we are firmly committed to these things, counterfactuals. And not only that, counterfactuals are incredibly useful in explaining causation. One of the other things David Lewis is famous for is giving a very influential account of what causation is in terms of counterfactuals. So you need counterfactuals. And for counterfactuals, you need possible worlds, according to Lewis. Now, these ersatzists say, but we can give you possible worlds without, believing in this huge. So here's where it seems hypocritical of David Lewis to criticize. So you don't want to believe that properties are like Plato's forms. You don't want to believe in those. You don't want to believe in propositions as abstract entities, because one of the things that Lewis says is, I can explain what propositions are. They are sets of possible worlds. The sets of possible, a proposition is simply the set of possible worlds in which that claim is true. So the proposition snow is white is a set of all the possible worlds in which snow is white. So this explains what propositions is without saying that propositions are this weird thing. They're not the same as sentences, because you can have two different sentences that express the same proposition. Schnee ist weiß, la neige est blanc, and snow is white. Those are three different sentences that all express the same proposition. So the proposition is not the same as the sentences. What is it? Well, Lewis says, I can say what a proposition is. It's a set of possible worlds. So it's this thing where it is reduction. Remember, in philosophy of mind, materialists are always trying to reduce talk about mental states to talk about physical states. Why? Because that explains something weird and abstract in terms of something concrete. That's how progress is made. It's like explaining heat in terms of the motion of the kinetic energy of molecules. You've explained what heat is. Heat was vague and poorly understood. Now it isn't. You've explained it. Lewis wants to do the same thing with phenomena like counterfactuals and causations and propositions. And he says all that it requires is modal realism. Because modal realism, he claims, allows reduction. Because realism about possible worlds doesn't, he says, although his critics deny this, doesn't require a commitment to modal notions. You're into problems of the kind that Quine was picking on in Two Dogmas of Empiricism if you say, I can explain modal notions using this other thing. But if you smuggle into this other thing a modal property that you haven't analyzed, then in a sense you've begged the question. You haven't explained modality in terms of something that isn't modal because you've smuggled in this modal notion. And that's a common criticism that that Lewis lobbies against his critics. He says your versions that you try to explain what necessity is in terms of possible worlds, you bring in a notion very much of the same group as necessity, a modal notion. And the modal notion in linguistic ersatzism, for example, is consistent, because consistent means part of the same possible world, says Lewis. Okay, so the realism is required, says Lewis, in order to do all of these reduction things. Now, one of the things that Quine or a sort of descendant of Quine's criticisms of de re possibility, is the problem of transworld identity. So suppose we believe in possible worlds. These possible worlds are supposed to settle the issue of whether or not, for example, to use Kripke's example, Hubert Humphrey could have won the 1968 election. Of course, Richard Nixon won the 1968 election in the USA, and he was running against Hubert Humphrey, who in our actual world lost. Could Hubert Humphrey have won? This is a counterfactual. We want to know if it's true or not. Well, in order to know whether it's true of Humphrey, so if we're talking in day, could Hubert Humphrey have been the winner of the election? Well, there has to be a possible world in which Hubert Humphrey is the winner of the election. But the challenge goes, suppose we look at this possible world and there's somebody other than Nixon winning that election. How do we know that that's Humphrey? Well, here's the thing. Here's where Leibniz's law comes in. Leibniz props up a lot. Leibniz has a lot of laws that are cited in various contexts, but the relevant one here is called the indiscernibility of identicals. That is, in order for something to be me, it has to be indiscernible. In order for something to be identical with me, that is, one and the same as me, it has to be indiscernible from me. It has to have all of my properties. But the thing is that if Hubert Humphrey in our world is the loser, then if you say that's Hubert Humphrey in another possible world winning the election, how can you say that's Hubert Humphrey? Because Hubert Humphrey lost the election. So how can it be the case that Hubert Humphrey both won the election in this other possible world and lost the election? It seems like this leads to contradiction, and also how can you say that's Hubert? How can you even identify Hubert Humphrey as Hubert Humphrey if he doesn't have all the properties of Hubert Humphrey? Now, Lewis himself agrees with the indiscernibility of identicals, and he says, yes, that's right. In order to be me, something has to be identical to me. Side note, Lewis also has very ingenious theories about time, about change through time, because you might say, wait a minute, but I was a baby, or 5 minutes ago I had skin cells that I have since shed. So are you saying that I am not the same as me 5 minutes ago because I'm not identical with me, and I'm certainly not the same as me as a baby because I'm very different from that? And Lewis would say, no, you as a baby is not you. You as a baby is a time slice of you. You are a four-dimensional object. That four-dimensional object has properties, including the property of being this size as a baby and this size as an adult. But it's just one thing. That's not you and this is you. That's a part of you and this is a part of you. And so you actually, there is no you that is different from you, if you see what I mean. So he's what's called a four-dimensionalist. All right, so that's how he's able to say that nothing could be me unless it has all my properties. All right, well, but if he buys into that, then how can he make sense of claims like Hubert Humphrey could have won the election? Well, this is where counterpart theory, a key part of Lewis's theory of possible worlds, comes in. He says, what makes it true that Hubert Humphrey could have won the election is that there is not Hubert Humphrey in another possible world, because, as he puts it, all individuals are world-bound. You only exist in the world that you call actual. I only exist in this world. What about the me in this other possible world who is emperor of the universe? That's not me, says Lewis. That's my counterpart. That is a being that is not me, but that is similar to me in relevant details. Now, what the relevant details are change depending on what issue we're interested in. So there's no essential properties that something has to have to be, or at least there's no one set of essential properties that something has to have to be me in another possible world. It depends on what we're interested in. But the me in this other possible universe that is emperor of the universe is my counterpart. Now, this idea of counterpart theory, it avoids the problem of transworld identity, because he says, no, you can't have identity across worlds. That there's only you in this world, and that person in another world who is your counterpart is not you. And this makes sense of, what happens in Marvel movies where people meet their counterparts in other possible worlds. They don't think that they're the same person. They're obviously different people. And he says, so your counterpart in another world is not you. But then the critics could say, well, wait a minute, though. And this is essentially, there's in the big footnote from Naming and Necessity, where Kripke brings up the objection from concern, and he's the one who talks about Hubert Humphrey. And he says something to the effect of, Hubert Humphrey doesn't give a shit about somebody else winning the election, which is what the counterpart theory says happens. He doesn't care that somebody else in another possible world wins the election. He wants it to be him. And by extension, Kripke is saying, in order to make sense of counterfactuals like Hubert Humphrey could have won the election, it has to be Hubert Humphrey in that other possible world winning the election. Otherwise, it doesn't make it true that Hubert Humphrey could have won the election. Lewis's response is, first of all, he says, I do believe that Hubert Humphrey in this world has the property could have won the election. Does he have the property did win the election? No, of course not. He lost. But he has the property, and it's a modal property, could have won. Why does he have that property, says Lewis? Because his counterpart does. So, yes, that's not him. It's his counterpart, but it's his counterpart that explains why he does have that property. And all that you need to make sense of our counterfactuals is that the actual Hubert Humphrey has the possibility could have won. Then you ask, well, in virtue of what does he have the property could have won? And Lewis says, here's my answer. Here's how, in virtue of what Hubert Humphrey, the actual one, has the property could have won, because his counterpart did. Now, it can't be Hubert Humphrey, this is Lewis's rebuttal. It can't be Hubert Humphrey in another possible world, A, because of Leibniz's law, and also because that would mean that Hubert Humphrey has contradictory properties. Hubert Humphrey won and Hubert Humphrey lost. You've got a contradiction. That can't happen. And another response that Lewis says is only counterpart theory can avoid transitivity problems. So, for example, imagine you've got a bicycle. You've got a bicycle, and this bicycle could be different in certain ways. If you change one screw, this is the question of identity of objects. Would it be the same bicycle if I changed the tire? Sure, it would. You don't think your bicycle becomes a different bicycle if you change the tire. Would it be the same bicycle if you changed everything? Obviously not. So how much can you change? He says, imagine that we say you can change 50% of the parts and it's the same bicycle. All right, well then imagine two possible worlds relative to ours. In one, there's the bicycle that changes less than 50%. So we would have to say in that possible world, it's the same bicycle as ours. But then in the other possible world, it changes more than 50%. So we would say, relative to our possible world, that's not the same bicycle. So bicycle A is the same as our bicycle. Bicycle B is not the same. But here's the problem. There's less than 50% difference between bicycle A and bicycle B. So bicycle A and B are the same bicycle. Relative to bicycle A, bicycle B is within the bounds of enough change, of little enough change to be the same bicycle. Then you've got a problem. You've got the problem that you're saying my bicycle is the same as bicycle A, but not the same as bicycle B. But bicycle A is the same as bicycle B. So you're saying A equals B, and my bicycle equals A. And then by transitivity, you would have to say, by the rules of identity, if my bicycle is the same as A, and A equals B, then my bicycle is the same as B. But you're denying that. So you get into transitivity problems if you say that the thing in the other possible world is. This is the problem of transworld identity. If you're saying that thing in the possible world actually is the same, then you run into those problems. I can avoid those problems because I never claim that the thing in the other possible worlds is the same. I say it's just a counterpart. So I don't get these worries. Counterpart relation doesn't have to follow transitivity. Identity does. So I can just say, yeah, the counterpart of my bicycle is bicycle A, not bicycle B. But the counterpart of bicycle A is both my bicycle and bicycle B. That's perfectly okay. What are, oh yes, Kripke. Kripke's view, exactly whether Kripke is an ersatist or not, is not entirely clear. Kripke, in naming a necessity, isn't really interested in much discussing the metaphysics of possible worlds. He's just interested in using possible worlds to solve problems, like Frege's problem of Hesperus and Phosphorus. But in a couple of asides, he does address, he seems to find Lewis's view ridiculous. It's the incredulous stare again. He does give this criticism, but he also says the problem of transworld identity that other people, including Lewis, are interested in, he says, I don't get it. If you're worried by the issue of transworld identity, you're mistaking what possible worlds are. Possible worlds are just whatever we want them to be. So it's not the case that he says, it's not the case that there are these possible worlds, and in order to work out whether or not Humphrey could have won the election, we have to be able to look through our telescope and identify Humphrey and try and find out if he won the election. No, he says, you can just say, that's Humphrey, because you're making this stuff up. You can say, that's Humphrey, and he's the winner. This is related to his idea of a rigid designator. A rigid designator is something that picks out the same object in all possible worlds. Now, will that object have all the same properties? No. Well, then what makes it the same? And he says, because we say it does. It's up to us. We stipulate, is that Nixon? It is if we say it is. It is if the name Nixon in our real, actual universe picks out that object. So he's sort of saying, stop getting caught up in the idea that, these are real things. These are just ways of talking that enable us to make sense of the way that we speak, and enable us to respond to Quine's challenges to the way we speak, and to sort of clear up Quine's objections. But it doesn't commit ourselves to the existence of things. So that makes him kind of an ersatist, at least. And what Lewis would say in response is, you're just not aware of the cost of what you're doing. You can't get away with just saying possible worlds are, possible worlds are just whatever makes this possible. You have to explain how this would work. And if you explain it in terms of a possible world is linguistic, it's just a set of properties. In his book on the plurality of worlds, Lewis lists three kinds of ersatzeism. The main one is linguistic, although Kripke might fall under magical. But linguistic is the one where a possible world is just a description. It's a complete description of the way things could have been. And what Lewis says is this can't, we've already seen one criticism. He says that ersatzeism isn't able to reduce modal notions to non-modal notions, whereas his worlds, he says, can. Now, in response to that, some critics have said, well, in order for his worlds to not to have modal notions, you would have to not talk about possible worlds, so you would just have to talk about worlds, and then the worlds would have to include impossible worlds, because we can actually talk about impossible worlds too when we say that certain things aren't possible. And then Lewis doesn't want to say that impossible worlds exist. So Lewis wouldn't be able to distinguish between possible and impossible worlds, because to do that he would have to smuggle in modal notions. Anyway, so whether or not Lewis's reduction is as clean as he says, and whether or not he can do without irreducible modal notions, his critics disagree on. But here's what we've already seen Lewis's objection to ersatzeism, that they smuggle in modal notions like consistency. A couple of other important criticisms against ersatzeism. Alien properties. He says it's possible that there are properties so different from the properties in our world that we can't even imagine them, that we don't have the language to describe them. Such things could not be part of an ersatz linguistic possible world, because in ersatz linguistic possible world, an ersatz linguistic possible world actually exists in our world. Now, exists as an abstract object. It's not made of molecules or anything, but it exists in the way that numbers exist. And it makes use of the resources of the actual world. And the resources of the actual world don't include the ability to describe these alien properties. They're so different. So if possible worlds are just descriptions using the resources of our actual world, then the ersatzists would have to say they cannot contain alien properties. So therefore, alien properties can't be possible, because our possible worlds describe everything that is possible, and they can't describe that. But, says Lewis, that just seems wrong. Alien properties surely could be possible. And to give an analogy to illustrate this, he says, imagine a simpler world than ours that doesn't have the resources to distinguish between some of the properties that we do. They couldn't describe, like a blind person couldn't describe the differences between colors. So imagine a blind universe. Relative to them, our world wouldn't be describable in their language. So if they're ersatzists, they would have to say that our world is not possible. Clearly our world is possible, because here it is. So by extension, the alien world is possible, and ersatzists are forced to say that it isn't, so therefore ersatzism is a defective view of possibility. The other thing is indiscernibles. We can imagine a universe that contains a bunch of indiscernible objects. They can't be described in linguistic terms so that you can distinguish between them. Whereas if they're real, imagine I get cloned and I'm in a room full of identical clones of me. You cannot say which one is me, but if I'm real, one of them is me and I know who it is, whereas a description of it wouldn't be able to capture that, wouldn't be able to capture the me-ness of me. Given that a universe containing indiscernibles, things that are impossible to tell apart, that's possible. Ersatzism can't deal with that, so ersatzism is defective. Another problem that Lewis has with alternatives to his view is because any view other than his has the problem of transworld identity, has to claim that it's me in that other possible world, like Kripke is saying, it has to be Humphrey in the possible world where he wins for him to care about it. How can you make sense of the fact that Humphrey both loses and doesn't lose? Well, Plantinga's suggestion is that you can index properties to the world. So you say, Plantinga says there's no contradiction. Humphrey is a winner in our world, call it W1. Sorry, a loser in our world, call it W1, and a winner in that other world, call it W2. There's no contradiction between between Humphrey having the properties winner in world, loser in world 1, winner in world 2. Those aren't contradictory properties any more than me having the properties weighs 10 pounds in 1968 and weighs 205 pounds in 2023. You're not saying I weigh both 10 pounds and 205 pounds. You're saying I weigh 10 pounds in 1968 and 205 pounds in 2023. Those aren't contradictory. But Lewis says, but we believe that we have certain properties, even ones that aren't necessary to us, even what are called accidental properties like height. We have them intrinsically. We don't have, it's weird to say that my height isn't a property of me, it's a relation. That seems to be what someone like Plantinga is saying, that my height is not a property that's part of me, it's a property relative to something else. So put it this way, your intrinsic properties are sort of internal to you. We all have extrinsic properties too, like I'm a brother, I have a sister. Now, I only have the property of being a brother because of my sister. It's not an intrinsic property of me. If something were to happen to my sister, if she were to pop out of existence, let's say, then I would lose the property of being a brother, and I might not even know. Whereas we think we do have intrinsic properties, like our height and our weight. Lewis says that Plantinga's solution to the problem of transworld identity removes all of our intrinsic properties and turns them all into relations. But that's ridiculous. We have intrinsic properties. They're not world relative. I'm not, so-and-so height in this world. I'm that height. And that's because he believes that there's only one of me. Have I covered just about everything? Well, obviously not, because I've only been talking for about an hour and this is just endless. But the applications that Lewis says, look, people can't believe that I really believe in the realness of other possible worlds. And he says, I do. I legitimately do. And he says, I haven't been able to win many converts, but the reason I do is because without them, I can't do all these wonderful things with my philosophy that I can, like explain causation, like explain free will. I mean, what does it mean to say that I have free will? It means I could have done otherwise. What does that mean? It means in another possible world, my counterpart does do otherwise. So you can't even make sense of free will without possible worlds, he says. Another use that Lewis didn't make of it, but just to show that it infects just about every area of philosophy, is the discussion of the harm of death. So why is it that we think that people who die young, like James Dean, in some sense their death is more harmful to them than people who die in their sleep aged 105? Answer, the intuitive answer is that James Dean was deprived of more life than somebody who dies at 105 in their sleep. But how do we make sense of that? The answer is because there's another possible world in which Dean doesn't crash his, what was his car? Something Spider. Porsche Spider, I think. He doesn't crash it, causing his head to get lopped off. Whenever he did that, he doesn't get into a crash, and he lives and makes several more movies of decreasing quality and goes steadily bald, but still he enjoys his life. So he missed out on all of those years that we know he would have had because he does have them in another possible world. So we can specify exactly how much he's harmed by his death by looking at a possible world. Now, how do we decide which possible worlds are relevant? Because, of course, there's the issue, well, wait a minute. How can we say how much James Dean is harmed by his death? Because in some universe, he's immortal. There's a universe in which James Dean never dies. So does that mean James Dean's death in this world is infinitely bad because he could have been immortal? Well, if that would be a bad implication of Lewis's view. So Lewis comes up with this notion of nearness of possible worlds. So for certain issues, the relevant possible world to settle the issue is going to be the nearest one. Now, how do you work out the nearest one? Closeness in the history, closeness in the laws of physics, those kind of things are going to be relevant. And he talks about that in some detail. So, and that comes up in the discussion of harm and death with people like Fred Feldman and Jeff McMahon and Ben Bradley talk about this kind of thing. The nearness of the possible world. We talk about in the nearest possible world in which something happened. So if we're talking about was James Dean harmed by his death, then the relevant possible worlds will be the ones as identical to this one as possible, except for the detail about him crashing his car. So if we take that away, then we can work out how much his death harms us by looking at what happens only in those nearest possible worlds. And we're not distracted by possible worlds in which James Dean is a dragon or James Dean is immortal or something like that. Or even though those possible worlds exist. Now, of course, there is the question is, could James Dean have been a dragon? Could James Dean have been a fire extinguisher? Is that possible? This is the kind of question that you have to be able to answer. And Kripke, it seems, has no answer to that. There's no way to answer that. He would say, well, if the name James Dean picks out in some possible world a fire extinguisher, then I guess he could. But then who decides whether or not the name James Dean is, given that Kripke rejects the idea of transworld identity, it's just up to us. So we have to, the only way to settle the issue is to say, well, do we say that the name James Dean picks out a fire extinguisher in some possible world? And that seems kind of unsatisfactory. Now, as I said, David Lewis, initially when he suggested this, everybody said, you got to be kidding me. And then he doubled down and wrote this book. And now, as Nolan, who wrote the book on David Lewis, says, more people have to take his view more seriously because of the book, in particular on the plurality of worlds, where he points out the problems for alternatives that other people hadn't really realized because they didn't have to take modal realism seriously. So given the seriousness of his criticisms of the alternatives, has that caused more people to come over to modal realism? Well, not really. It's caused more people to sort of drift back towards Quine's view that maybe, necessity can't be made sense of. But then you might say, but what about this idea that is gaining popular acceptance of multiple realities? It's not just in Marvel Comics. People talk about it as being an implication of certain views of physics. Well, that's not necessarily exactly what he means. It's not. Lewis's view on modal realism won't be proved by physics. It will be. It's settled by how valuable it is to our philosophy of the world. And it's not clear that these alternate realities do exactly what David Lewis's possible worlds do. But maybe a side effect of that entering popular culture will be that David Lewis gets fewer incredulous stares. Who knows?